surprised why. Somehow the way that the glasses were created, every time that you looked into a light, whether it was a street light or it was the car lights coming on, it appeared like snowflakes were in the light. I'm not totally sure how they did it, but it was actually really cool. But it was rather deceiving and even disappointing, of course, when I took them off, because the lights were not snowflakes after all. So James similarly instructs the church and us too to take off our glasses that we're currently using to look at the world and to look at people and replace them with God's eyes. For in God's eyes, it was actually the rich who were untrustworthy in this context. If you look at the passage here, it says that they were exploiting and they were dragging into court and they were blaspheming the name. And it was actually the poor, according to verse 5, that were blessed and that were rich in faith. So James, by using the example of favoritism towards the rich and over the poor, he shows them how wrong it is to have any kind of differential treatment to anyone. Everyone deserves the same treatment, friendship, acceptance, love, grace, and mercy. In God's economy, things are not as we would suppose them to be. Things on the exterior do not always reveal what is on the interior. But before we go further, I want to quickly define rich and poor according to this context and the way that we should also look at it now. So the verse says that the rich are wearing a gold ring and fine clothes. Now, these people are wealthy, and this is probably uncommon, especially in the new church that was developed, that this letter is written to. So it would have been quite a spectacle, honestly, to see a person walk in with this kind of adornment. And when you think of the rich people off the bat, some words that might come to our mind, things like power, influence, security, contentment, maybe being popular, accepted, pursued. Maybe these are some words that you would relate to someone being rich. And the poor, this verse says, came in with shabby clothes. What do you automatically think of when someone who is poor or needy comes to mind? Maybe some of these words: misfortune, longing. Maybe they've made bad decisions and it's led them to where they are today. Maybe they're a burden on society or to you. Maybe they have nothing to contribute. These are all words that we might associate with someone who might be poor or needy. And the word favoritism in this context, it originally means, in the Greek, raising someone's face or elevating a person. So raising someone else's face, elevating them. But it came to be known as exalting someone strictly on a superficial external basis, such as appearance, race, wealth, rank, or social status. So it was a biased judgment based only on the external. A couple of years ago, I went to a big missions and worship conference known as Urbana. I went with some students here from this campus here at FBC. And among many different breakout sessions that were available was one with a man named Shane Claiborne. Some of you guys may know who he is. He's very popular with kind of my generation. He's written a lot of books and a lot of people kind of cling to what he said. And I too respect some of the things that he has said. I've been challenged in my faith by what he has said. Anyways, there was a break-off session that people could go to. And because he was so popular, you would expect that, lines would kind of start forming. But even more surprisingly, there was a lunch hour right before, and people decided to not even eat so that they could line up in front of these doors so that they could go in and hear Shane Claiborne speak. So I was in this line, and as the line kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, slowly the time kept ticking on, and then finally it was time, and Shane Claiborne was going to be entering through the doors, and we would be able to hear from him. And it was so interesting to see how the mood immediately changed. We were at this Christian, conference for 5 days, and people were so loving and so merciful, opening up the doors to you, and God bless you, and how can I pray for you, et cetera, et cetera. But immediately the doors open, and people are shoving and pushing and not even acknowledging the person right next to them. And honestly, I was so taken aback by it and so shocked that I almost decided to just leave and not hear. Just because I'm like, what are we doing, right? What's the point of this? Anyways, I did end up saying he was a good speaker, but that experience still stood out in my mind a lot. So it may be with you that when you think of the rich or the poor, that you don't think that you particularly favor one over the other. You would say, I pretty much treat people with a higher income or a lower income pretty equally. But if you think in terms of these other words that maybe a rich person or a poor person could include, again, rich, power, influence, security, contentment, popular, accepted, pursued, and you think of poor as anyone who is different than that, longing, misfortune, bad decisions, burden on society, nothing that they can contribute, I think that we find fault at this too, even as Christians in the church. How many times has a rising Christian worship artist come, or a great theologian, or a book writer that you really respect come somewhere, and you're so excited to hear them or to hear what they have to say. But I think that can oftentimes create this mentality where we're favoring maybe a certain status of someone, maybe than just someone who's sitting right next to you who loves God equally as well, but maybe hasn't had the power and the prestige that person does. So how much easier is it to welcome in, interact, show mercy to someone who looks put together, has things under control, is known and accepted by others that you know? And how much harder is it to do the opposite with those people in your life? So we know that from verse 2, James is referring to when believers are gathered together for a worship service, because the word meeting in Greek means synagogue. So let's look at it from our context. We're here today in 2012. I almost said 2011. We're in 2012. What does it look like in our context today here at FBC? So it would not be fair, just first off, to get this out of the way, to say that the wealthy here among our church community are like those in the book of James. Because James says that they are the ones who exploit us and drag us into court. Now, I'm not sure, but I don't think any of you are really fearful of coming here on a Sunday morning or some different event and thinking that someone who has a higher income might take you to court the next day. I don't think that's necessarily our challenge. And I also additionally think that the poor, those who are needy, look very different in our context too. If you imagine back in this time when James is writing, these are people that are really impoverished. They don't know necessarily when their next meal is going to be. They might only have one pair of clothes, things like that. And we do have those who have lost jobs and are really suffering in our community, but it looks slightly different, I think, in our church age. So what does the common ground seem to be, even though in the context James is talking about the rich and the poor here, and then here at FBC or whatever church community you're in, it's this, what is the common ground? I think the key is the key word is favoritism. So the idea is, can we think of any time in our life, any challenge that we have where favoritism may come into play? Maybe you don't, again, favor the rich over the poor, but maybe you can think about it more broadly. Maybe you can redefine what needy actually means. So once graduating from 5th grade, I entered into Creekside Middle School. This was a big deal. We were old now. Old rules didn't apply anymore. We had 6 classes instead of 1 with 1 teacher, and recess was now lunchtime. So I had the same group of friends that came with me from elementary school to middle school. And there was one girl who kind of stood out from us, and her name was Manjeet. Manjeet grew up in an India family. Her family was from India. And they always kind of were slightly different than us. They ate slightly different foods for her at lunchtime. She dressed slightly differently. She had kind of some different cultural lingo that she would use and that we didn't really understand. And she was kind of honestly one of those people that you would say is kind of a follower. So one day, one of my friends within this group decided that we should ditch Manjeet now that we were in middle school. So we devised this plan thinking we were very clever. We walked down this corridor as we were all together, and we would continue walking, and then at the strategic time, we would all veer off to the left, and Manjeet would continue walking. Now, this obviously is not a brilliant plan. It was middle school minds who were thinking of this. Also very sad, too, that this was our plan. But anyways, so we decided this was the day we were going to execute the plan. So we start walking, and then we continue walking, and then we realize that she's kind of continuing walking, so we all run off to the left. And obviously, it didn't work. Manjeet saw us running. But the consequences were really sad. She was devastated. And I don't think we really had words to explain to her why, because I don't think we were justified in the reasons why we didn't want her to be a part of our group. So Manjeet to me was viewed as that other person. It was so much easier to welcome in, interact with, show mercy, to favor other, honestly more, in my eyes, cooler people than Manjeet. Now I want you to stop for a few seconds and have you think about who